Mischief Night by Shane Migliavacca. Ray had a bad feeling in his gut. Bud had a sinister look in his eye tonight. It was Bud's idea they go out. There was an unreasonably cold chill to this October night. Most likely the reason the trick-or-treaters were starting to thin out. Bud wanted to do some trick-or-treating of his own. Ray knew Bud long enough to know that meant some kind of crime would be perpetrated by them tonight. Bud swung a beat-up paper sack back and forth as they walked. When Ray had asked, Bud told him only that it was a surprise. Ray didn't like his friend's surprises all that much, but without him, Ray would never have made it this far in life. His mother was an out-of-work nurse, his dad a foreman at a chemical plant. Stuck home with a kid and a husband that was never around, she took her frustrations out on Ray, smacking him around. His dad, too busy and too tired from long shifts, failed to notice or care. When he was 15, Ray ran away from home. Those first few years had been harder than hell. He'd resorted to things he'd never thought he was capable of. Then he met Bud. A former runaway himself, they were kindred spirits. Bud knew his way around the streets. Ray owed him. No matter what the man did, he wouldn't desert him. Not to mention, he was more than a little afraid of him. A kid in a skeleton costume bounded down the sidewalk towards them, happily clutching a full bag of candy in his arms. As he passed by, Bud stuck out a leg, sending the kid crashing to the sidewalk, his bag of candy landing next to him, some of the candy spilling onto the sidewalk and lawn. The kid started blubbering as he rubbed his knee. Bud knelt down and looked at the kid. "Did you have a nice trip, kid?" The kid shook his head back and forth. "You tripped me." "Maybe you're just clumsy, kid," Bud laughed. He snatched up the kid's bag of candy. "Hey, that's mine!" the kid hollered. "Give it back!" There was a flash of steel. Bud held out a switchblade he carried. "Shh," he whispered. Ray felt his heart quicken. What was Bud gonna do to this kid? He'd never seen him hurt a kid. Could he go that far? Kill a kid? "Listen, kid," Bud said. "This is my candy now. Mine. You tell anybody about it, your parents, a cop, anybody, and I'll make you watch as I kill 'em. 'Cause I'm the boogeyman, and I know where you live. Got it?" The kid, near tears, more than likely pissing his pants, nodded. "Good. Now run the fuck along, and don't talk to fucking strangers." The kid hightailed it as Bud laughed, sniffing the air as he looked at Ray. "I think that kid shit his pants. Or was it you?" "Fuck," Ray managed. "Fuck, man." This made Bud laugh louder, handing the bag of ill-gotten candy to Ray. "Have some." Shaking his head, Ray reached into the bag, grabbing a small bag of Sour Patch Kids. "What are we doing out here tonight, man?" He popped a red Sour Patch into his mouth. "Besides mugging little kids." "Well, my man, I want to do something more adult than trick-or-treating." Bud motioned to the houses up and down the street. "Pick one. Pick a good one, and we'll have ourselves some fun." Ray let his eyes wander over the houses. Nice upper-middle-class homes, some decorated to the hilt for Halloween, others bore nothing at all. One house in particular, a large Grim Reaper, stood on the lawn, his eyes glowing. A witch stood next to him, cackling at a passerby. Purple, orange, and green lights decorated the house's exterior. A large glowing ghost hung on the front door, loudly wailing at little kids as they walked up to the front door. "That one," Ray pointed. Bud nodded in approval. A pretty brunette answered the door, handing out candy to the little kids waiting there. "Good choice." Amanda followed the outline on the construction paper, a detailed drawing of a skeleton grinning at her. She'd always been pretty good at drawing. Cutting things with scissors was another thing. Next to her, Amanda's little brother Kyle coughed as he colored in a pumpkin she'd drawn earlier. They sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by snacks and colored paper. "What a drag," stuck at home on Halloween night looking after her sick kid brother. Her parents were off to have dinner and then a movie. She was missing Stevie Lee's big Halloween party at the Mill Creek Farms. She'd just got her driver's license and barely got to use it. Why couldn't her parents cancel? Why'd it have to be her? She looked at her brother. It sucked for him, too. He'd really been looking forward to trick-or-treating tonight. Instead, they were stuck home together. Both of them had gotten bored watching horror movies on TV. She decided maybe making something would lift their spirits. The Horror-a-thon will be back with Night of the Killer Lobsters after a word from our ghoulish sponsors. The television played in an empty living room. The ghost hanging on the front door wailed, breaking Amanda's thoughts. The scissors slipped, causing her to poke her thumb. "Oh, shit," she hollered. "You okay?" Kyle asked. "Yeah, you didn't hear me swear, right?" He gave her a thumbs up. There was a loud knock at the door. "Want me to get it?" her brother asked. Amanda stood, holding the scissors in one hand. "I'll get it." There was another loud knock. "Coming! Coming!" Amanda shouted over the ghost's howl. "Hold your fucking horses," she said under her breath. "Look," a man warned on television. "There's one of them now," as a lobster superimposed over the side of a car, menacing some kids in Lover's Lane. Walking past an upright piano set against one wall, setting the scissors on the coffee table, Amanda picked up her mom's large ceramic bowl. According to her, it was some family heirloom. A red drop hit the beige carpet. "Shit," Amanda growled, looking at the trail of blood drops on the carpet behind her. She hadn't thought the scissors had broken the skin of her thumb. Now she'd have to get bloodstains out of the carpet before Mom and Dad get home. What next? There was another furious knock. Yeah, she said, this time not even trying to hide her annoyance. The pile-up of the night's events getting to her. So much so Amanda forgot to look through the window to see who was out there first. Something she always did. Unlocking the door, she yanked it open. 2 men in plastic clown masks stood, waiting. Amanda stood, hesitating. The rest of it was cut off as the closer of the 2 men drove a fist into her stomach, knocking the air out of her lungs and doubling her over. Mom's precious heirloom hitting the floor, shattering, sending candy spilling over the floor. Before she could recover, strong hands shoved her back into the living room, the 2 men rushing in after her. The second man closes the door, locking it and turning off the lights. Amanda tries to stand, earning another punch to the stomach from the first man. "We good?" he asks. The second peeks out through the curtains. "Golden," he answered, keeping watch through the drawn curtains. Amanda staggered, hunched over, barely able to gasp for air, much less form words. She wanted to warn her brother, scream out for help. Anything. The first man grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head up so they were face to face. His gloved hand touched her cheek. In his other, he held a switchblade. "You alone, girlie?" Yeah, she gasped. "What's a looker like you doing all alone on Halloween night?" I was grounded, she managed, tears burning her eyes. "That's so. Wouldn't be lying, would you? Don't have a boyfriend stashed somewhere? Maybe a girlfriend? You know what they say, when the cat's away, the mice'll play." "You playin', pretty mouse?" Amanda coughed. "No." "Too bad," he lamented. "Gonna behave?" "Yes, please, take whatever and go," she pleaded. The first man picked up the family portrait sitting on the mantel. God, she hoped Kyle had heard everything and run and hid. Or maybe he'd run out the kitchen door, heading to one of the neighbors for help. He was a smart kid, it was possible. "Who says we want to take anything?" he answered. "Where's Junior here?" he said, tapping on the picture. "He went with my parents, trick-or-treating," Amanda answered. "Did he now?" Her watery eyes wandered the room. Not too far away sat the scissors on the coffee table. So far, all she'd seen was the guy's knife. No guns. If she could reach the scissors... The man chuckled loudly. She met his eyes. He'd seen her looking at the scissors. Amanda lunged, leaping towards the scissors. "Don't think so," first man said, cutting her off with another punch. Amanda staggered and fell to her knees, the world fading in and out of blackness as the carpet came rushing up to meet her as she fell. Ray saw the girl go down in a flash, turning away from the window when he heard the commotion. She hit the carpeted floor and went limp. Bud knelt down, checking the girl. Out like a light, he stood, motioning Ray over. I'll stay here with the princess. I want you to check the place out. They gotta have something valuable stashed here. Mommy might have some jewelry, or Daddy might have some cash squirreled away. Check the bedrooms first. Okay, man. Then we can get out of here, Ray said. Her parents could be back any time. Go, find something good, Bud said. And if you see somebody, a boyfriend or the brat, he drew a finger across his throat. I'll entertain myself while I wait, he smiled. Ray nodded before leaving. God, he'd be happy when they were out of there. When he could take off the crummy mask, he was sweating like crazy. Besides the mask, Ray was scared. Bud was really on a rip tonight. He knew what Bud was going to do with the girl, and he wanted no part of it. The fear in his bones of what Bud might do to even him stopped Ray from helping the girl. Best he could do was find some shit so they could get the hell out of there. Heading upstairs, Ray searched as quick as he could. A bathroom, the boys' bedroom, then the girls'. Nothing. At least there was no boyfriend waiting up here. No little brother playing in his room either. That left the parents' bedroom. Fuck, he hoped there was something valuable there. He feared what Bud's reaction would be if he came back empty-handed. He dumped the dresser drawers. Clothes, a dildo, and some papers. Bills, mostly. Zip for anything worth a shit. Looked like the closet was it. Come on, fucks, he said to himself. You're killing me here. Opening the sliding closet door, lots of clothes, mostly the mother's. The shelf was crammed full of stuff, but there was one thing that stood out. A metal box. Bingo. He reached up, pulling it down. A box of pictures fell, spilling on the floor. Holding the heavy box in his arms, Ray saw something that made his heart stop. A little kid hiding in the corner of the closet, huddled behind some of the clothes. The kid's eyes widened when he met Ray's gaze. Ray put a finger to his lips. Not a word, kid, he whispered. He knelt, setting the box on the floor, staring at the kid. What the fuck was he gonna do? If he brought the kid downstairs, Bud would kill him for sure. Ray had a fairly good idea of what Bud was probably up to now with the girl. Even if Bud let the brat live, there was no reason to subject him to seeing that. Reaching into his back pocket, Ray pulled out his own knife, looking into the kid's terrified eyes. Ray recognized what he saw there. How many times he had looked up with those same eyes at his mom as she beat the piss out of him. No, he couldn't kill the kid. I want you to stay here, he whispered. Me and my buddy are going soon. Don't come out of here till somebody comes and gets you, okay? The kid nodded. Good, Ray said. He clapped a hand over the kid's mouth. One more thing. Don't worry. I ain't gonna hurt you. It'll just sting a little. Ray drew the blade out down the kid's cheek, opening up a small cut. The kid squirmed, wanting to holler in pain, Ray's hand suppressing the cry. Done. Ray dabbed some of the blood from the cut on his blade. He wasn't taking any chances. If Bud thought he'd killed the kid, that should keep him from wanting to look for the kid. Picking up one of the father's t-shirts from the floor, Ray wadded it up and handed it to the kid, telling him to press it to his cheek. Closing the closet again, Ray picked up the metal box, setting it on the bed. Using a solid metal ashtray, he smashed off the flimsy padlock. Inside the box, it was like Christmas morning had come early. Jewelry and a couple of envelopes of cash. Score. Picking up his prize, Ray headed downstairs. Amanda heard gentle music playing over the screams of terror coming from the television. She felt the softness of the rug against her back. Her body ached, and she wasn't sure why. Her eyes focused on the man playing the piano. Amanda saw the clown mask, and reality came crashing back. The last things she remembered was trying to grab the scissors and then nothing. Save for scattershot images, the man over her, the sounds of fabric tearing. Oh God. She rolled over onto her belly, The other man came rushing in, excited, and holding the metal box from her parents' closet. The first man opened it, letting out a jubilant hoot. She couldn't hear their words over the frenzy on the TV. Words or no words, Amanda knew what the blood on the other man's knife meant, as he showed it to the first. Ray bounded down the stairs, eager to show Bud the loot. Somebody was playing music, a piano or something. In the living room, Bud sat at the small piano, playing without a care in the world. The girl lay on the carpet, her clothes shredded. He knew what Bud had in mind for the girl. He could have... No, best not to dwell on it. There was nothing he could have done. They were almost out of there anyway. He showed him the contents of the box, and then the knife. "Good work," Bud said, looking at Ray's bloody knife. "You're a man now." He motioned towards the girl. "Want some?" "Can we just get out of here?" Ray asked. Fine. I'm getting restless anyway." Bud stood, tickling the piano keys. A wail of anguish and rage rose up over the piano, over the screams on the television. The men turned to see a bloodied, beaten banshee standing before them, the scissors in her hands. The girl's expression was filled with so much hate. Ray felt shivers run up and down his spine. She lunged. Ray felt the hot spray hit his face. Blood. Not his, though. He looked over to see the scissors pulling away from Bud's neck, a large, bloody hole left in their wake. Bud tumbled over the piano bench, gurgling up blood as he desperately tried to stop it from jetting out of his neck, fastening his hands over the wound, blood flowing between his fingers. Standing there, petrified, Ray couldn't help but watch his friend squirm about on the carpet floor, the girl jamming Bud repeatedly in the groin with the scissors. The knife slipped from his fingers. The girl turned from the now dead Bud, her eyes bloodshot. She howled with anger. "Please," Ray begged, his body finally responding. He ran towards the door, slipping on the spilled candy inches from his goal. He grabbed a large, jagged shard of the broken candy bowl, slicing his gloved hand, swinging at the crazed girl, cutting her arm. The pain didn't faze her as she plunged the scissors into Ray's right eye socket with a sickening crunch. Frenzied, Ray pushed her away, fumbling for the door lock. The only thought in his dying brain was to get away, but his fingers couldn't seem to manage the lock. Ray heard the girl breathing behind him, pulling the scissors from his eye socket. He blindly sliced the air with them. The crazed girl crouched, watching him, till finally his body gave out, and he collapsed against the door. It was hard to believe the girl, her face covered with a blank white mask, was his sister. Kyle visited her from time to time at the sanitarium. He was 16 now, the same age she'd been when it happened. He touched the scar on his cheek, a constant reminder of that night. Amanda sat there in the day room, staring out the window, never moving, her head never turning. Dr. Chandler said she was near catatonic. The mask, he said, she'd started wearing to hide her shame. After that man found him in the closet, Kyle had stayed hidden, staying there till his parents had found him. Amanda had believed the man killed him. Perhaps she still did. The doctors were afraid to let him talk to her. The first time had been a disaster. He blamed himself for what happened to her, even though his parents, the cops, and his shrink told him there was nothing he could have done. He'd only been a scared little boy. Sometimes he dreamed about her. Not of that night, no. He dreamed of her escaping here, finding her way over his bed, a pair of bloody scissors in her hand. He watched her for a while. She was so unnaturally patient, gazing out that window, staring into the distance, waiting. Caves by Joe Salmo. "Becky, where are you?" Janice asked, trying to peer out of the rain-coated windshield. The downpour was almost too much for the wipers on the 67 Camaro to handle, even on the fastest setting. Janice turned the old AM/FM radio down, silencing The Cure's "Friday I'm in Love." She gripped the handle on the door as the classic muscle car traveled down the dirt road that led seemingly nowhere. Easy. If you get a scratch on this car, your dad is going to kill you. I still don't know why we couldn't just go to the lake like we normally do, Janice said, scooching her butt on the recently redone black leather seats. You don't have to tell me. I remember when I dropped my ice cream in his '50 Chevy. I couldn't sit for a week, she replied. Last time at the lake was too close. Out here, no one will see us. I still don't know why you think we should hide it. We're happy together, that's all that matters, Janice said, placing her hand on Becky's shoulder. I think my parents would understand. Maybe yours would, but my father sure wouldn't. To him, I'm still Daddy's little girl who should wear pink and like horses and boys. It's only for a few months, then we graduate and we can leave this tiny town and start over in a new city. Did you hear back from any of the schools you applied to yet? Becky asked as she navigated the car down the old logging trail. Years of misuse had let some of the underbrush grow back and come close to scraping the custom paint job on her father's prized possession. How much further is it? Janice said, adjusting her seatbelt that cut across her large breasts. She tucked the cross strap behind her for comfort. It's been like 10 years since I've been here, but I don't think it's much further. You remember Veronica? Her mom brought us here hiking once in the Girl Scouts. There are traces of Native American painting and shit on the walls in the caves. It'll be a cool place for us to be alone, Becky said. Really alone, Janice said, planting a kiss on Becky's cheek. Becky slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a halt. What's wrong? Don't like my kisses anymore? Janice said playfully. It's not that. We're here. And it's on foot from here anyway, Becky said. We have to walk in this shit? Janice said, looking down at the peep-toe heels she was wearing. You didn't tell me we would have to walk in the mud to get there. I got it covered, don't worry, Becky said, and reached into the back seat. Her breast nearly escaped her tube top, exciting Janice. A backpack materialized in her hands and she placed it between them. She drew an old pair of sneakers and socks out of the bag. They shared a shoe size, something they had learned in junior high. They began to wear each other's clothes shortly after, and soon they found they had feelings for each other. Being from such a small town, they knew no one would understand, so they kept it quiet, pretending to just be friends, but they were so much more. Janice still remembered the first time they kissed. It was just a dare. They were still hiding their feelings for each other at the time, but as soon as their lips touched, Janice's heart skipped a beat, and it hasn't caught up since. Becky was her whole life, her reason for getting out of bed every day, and she couldn't wait until they could tell the world, until she could wake up to her soulmate every single day. What would I do without you? Janice asked, and actually meant it. Probably chase after Justine. She has bigger boobs than me, Becky joked, squeezing her own breasts. You know it's more than just physical, right? Janice said. She was always afraid that was what Becky thought. She was never good at expressing herself, and sometimes a quip, usually about sex, was how it came out. I know, babe. Now change those shoes so we can get going, Becky said and killed the engine. She put the keys in a small pouch on the front of the blue backpack. What else do you have in here? Janice asked as she tied the sneakers. A surprise for us, she said, and reached into the backseat again. This time, Becky pulled out 2 cheap plastic rain ponchos and a flashlight. The rain was coming down so hard it made the forest look like night had fallen already, even though dusk wasn't for a few more hours yet. Janice opened the door and hopped out, nearly falling onto the muddy forest floor. A slight scream from the other side of the car let her know Becky wasn't having an easier time. She ran around the front of the car in the driving rain. Where to, my love? Janice said over the sound of the rain pounding onto the metal of the car. Becky pointed towards a gate and headed toward it. She didn't have a key for it, but it was the woods. You could just walk around it. She hoped once they got into the woods, the trees would protect them from the rain, but the rain proved too much for the leaves above. She was glad she put the backpack on before the poncho. Janice caught up to her and slipped a wet hand into her own. With a squeeze, she led her forbidden lover into the forest based on a 10-year-old memory. It really isn't that far from here, maybe 20 minutes, Becky said. There's a big rock that looks like a big ass. Once we see that, we're close. Figured you would like a big ass, Janice said. I like your ass just the way it is. Come on, the faster we get there, the faster we can get dry, Becky said. Odd way to phrase what we have planned, Janice joked. Ha ha, babe, Becky replied and climbed over a fallen pine. She helped Janice over the slick bark. The cold of the rain was starting to settle in as they hiked the path, and their conversation came to a halt shortly after. The next few minutes went on in silence until they reached a stream that crossed the path. A worn plank of wood crossed it, worn with age and weather. It looked sketchy as to if the plank would hold for their crossing. Okay, I really remember this. We're almost there. The ass rock should just be up there. We could probably see it from here if the goddamn rain would let up, Becky said. Motion. There was definitely motion. What would be out in this weather? Even the deer have hauled up somewhere, it thought. It put a furry paw farther onto the thin branch and moved closer for a better view. It looked down on the two shapes as they passed below. A bright yellow. He couldn't place it, but the sounds they made sparked a memory. It took a few minutes for its sluggish brain to access the right path. Hibernation will do that. It did remember a time, last hunting season, where it came across these monsters. It cocked its head and watched as they walked towards the natural cave system it called home. It jumped from limb to limb, racing the strange bipedal creatures back to its lair. Here's Ass Rock, just like I said, Becky said. I wish I brought Dad's Polaroid too. Could have gotten a picture with it, she joked. Didn't he just get that? He probably wouldn't have let you take it anyway, Janice said from beside her. Yeah, you're right. If I remember, there was a bunch of evergreens. Oh, there they are. We're here, Becky said excitedly and took off for the trees. Wait, Janice said and chased after her. There was a moment of panic when she lost sight of Becky, but all was well when she peeked out of the branches of a young pine. Now she could see behind them was a rock wall, about 20 feet tall. Becky was peeking out from a hole in those rocks. Together they left the rain for the shelter of the cave. Becky's flashlight came to life, illuminating the stone walls of the cave. It seemed that a tunnel continued back into the ground. On the ground was the ancient remains of a fire pit. Janice noticed as she shed the poncho. Now what? She asked. Now we get a fire going and get dry, Becky said, pulling some wood and paper from the backpack. Oh, you're trying to appeal to the pyro in me, aren't you? Janice said, pulling her lighter out of her pocket and doing a few test flicks to make sure it still worked. I know you so well, Becky said, and took Janice in her arms. She kissed her, feeling the coldness of her lips from traveling through the woods. Inside and out, Janice responded in a whisper, then shivered. Let's heat this place up, Becky said, and grabbed the lighter from her friend. In a moment, the cave was lit by the orange light of the fire she created. She looked around the wall for the paintings she remembered as a kid, but didn't see them. She did see some asshole had spray-painted "Jack was here," though. She sighed. People just like to ruin stuff. Nothing was going to ruin this trip, though. Their time was too precious together to waste. Becky sat down next to Janice and held her hand. She was glad the warmth was coming back to her lover. She leaned in for a kiss. A moment passed, and the two started to forget about the world around them. And the only thing that mattered was them, this moment, the feelings they had for each other. Becky felt Janice's hand slide up her leg over her zipper, making her hold her breath in anticipation of the carnal pleasures she was expecting. It wasn't long until Janice undid the button and zipper and slid her slender fingers between the cloth and flesh. Becky moaned as Janice kissed her neck, her lips no longer cold as they were engorged with blood flow in the heat of the moment. She returned the neck kisses to Janice, kissing toward her immense cleavage. She could feel her breasts pressed up against her, and she wanted nothing more than to feel them slide down her own chest as her lover kissed, lower and lower, and... It scuttled out of the rain, shaking its furry body to shed the water as its large eyes adjusted. It cocked its head and turned its ears towards the strange sounds it heard from within. The firelight made it wary to get closer. But after closer inspection, it realized the two creatures were preoccupied. It scurried from shadow to shadow as it crossed the largest chamber of this branch of tunnel. It made it unnoticed and disappeared down the tunnel. "Janice," Becky whispered. "Yeah, Becky?" Janice replied as she turned in her lover's arms, placing her face on Becky's breast and looking up into her beautiful blue eyes. "I think I might just love you," she said. "You just figured that out?" Janice asked as she sat up and looked around for her shirt. "Yeah, I mean, I wasn't sure until you just rocked my world," Becky said with a smile and put 2 more small logs on the fire. They wouldn't have enough wood for much longer, but the romantic fire served its purpose, Becky thought. "Well, I'm glad I could help, part of the team," Janice said as she slipped her shirt over her head. Just then, there was a mewling sound. They both froze. "Did you hear that?" Janice asked. "Yeah, what was that?" Becky asked. "I don't know. You were the goddamn Girl Scout," Janice said, placing a cigarette in her mouth. She lit it and took a long puff. "Did it come from farther in the cave?" "Well, it wasn't one of us," Becky retorted and grabbed the flashlight, shining it down the tunnel that led to farther in the earth. 2 eyes light up in the beam. "What the fuck is that?" Janice asked. I don't know," Becky said, backing up and slipping her bare feet into her shoes. Is it a bear?" Janice said, taking another drag off her cigarette. "It's like a foot off the ground," Becky said, gaining enough courage to take a few steps closer. "Well, maybe a baby bear, like a cub or whatever," Janice said. I don't think so," Becky said and crouched down. "It's okay. You can come out here. We won't hurt you," she said to the pair of unblinking eyes, watching them. Soon the eyes were joined by another pair. Then 2 more. The mewling sound was getting louder and more frequent. The first pair of eyes moved closer, and Becky could finally see the creature that belonged to those eyes. I have no idea what it is. Well, besides cute," she said, going to her knees. She set the flashlight down on the stone floor of the cave and patted her thighs. "It's okay. Come on." "Are you sure it's a good idea to call to it?" Janice asked and crouched next to her lover. "Aren't wild animals dangerous?" "Well, look at it. Does it look dangerous?" Becky asked as she looked at the creatures now 10 feet away. Its brown and white striped fur illuminated in the flashlight. Its big green eyes made it look like a toy more than a creature. "It kind of looks like one of those red pandas," Janice said in a whisper that was full of wonder. "Yeah, I guess so," Becky replied and then held her breath as the creature came closer. The other ones were moving a little closer too. That dark spot around his mouth kind of looks like George Michael. I'm going to call him George. Come here, George," Becky called out. She held her hand out to the creature. It moved close enough for Becky to feel its whiskers scrape across her fingers. It rubbed its face against her hand and it felt so soft. Then it mewled again. The others behind it mewled in response. "Are you okay, Becky?" Janice asked. "Yeah, this is awesome." The first one mewled again. This time the others harmonized with the first, and then they all mewled together. "So cute. They remind me of those things in that movie that we went to see when we were 10. That thing that turned into gremlins," Becky said and slowly moved her hand to pet the creature. "It's okay, George. Don't be afraid." "Mongos?" Janice asked. "Mogwais. What the hell is a mongo? Isn't that the guy from Blazing Saddles?" Becky asked as they both began to laugh. "Oh, yeah," Janice said and put her cigarette out on the cold stone ground. She put her hand on Becky's shoulder. From this angle, she watched as her lover picked the animal up and clutched it to her chest. "It's okay, George, see?" she said and petted it. Its mewling grew higher in pitch. The other creatures matched the key change. "See, Janice? He likes it." Janice's lips parted in a smile. She placed her chin on Becky's shoulder. It is really cute. I wonder how many of them are in this cave. Ouch, Becky said, and took her hand off George's back. It had blood on it. What the hell cut me? She asked. Suddenly, all the mewling stopped, and every creature began to sniff the air. With almost twice the volume as the mewling, the creature in her lap screeched, showing a row of sharp teeth. Becky backed her head up in confusion, wondering what she did to upset George. Suddenly, spikes shot out of the fur on its back, sides, and forehead. The sharp protrusions easily penetrated Becky's soft flesh. As she fell limp into her lover's confused arms, she watched as a tide of these animals charged from the darkness, each bearing the same type of teeth that she now felt biting into her legs. Janice pulled away in horror, looking into the lifeless eyes of her lover as the creatures devoured her flesh. Her worst fear came true. She was going to be alone for the rest of her life. But at least, that wasn't going to be for very long. I Saw the Dragon by John Oak Dalton, a Weekly Spooky original. When I left Desert Storm in 91, all I'd done was run Saddam back in his rat hole. We let him off just like my grandpa told me they did to the Nazis back in World War II, when he drove a tank right up to Berlin and then had to sit there and wait for the Russians to come and trash the place. That was us in 1991. Got up to Baghdad and pulled the parking brake and sat there. So when my buddy Chisholm started talking about being a soldier of fortune afterwards, just like in the magazines, I was bored enough to try it. We thought we'd be like Crockett and Tubbs, only with less Phil Collins. We signed up with this for-hire outfit, and the first place we mustered out to was this African country that doesn't even exist anymore. It was run by the government, and then the rebels, and then the government, and if they were sitting on oil, or had anything anybody else wanted, it wouldn't have gone on like it did. The only thing they were exporting were refugees, only most of them got shot down at the border, so there weren't even that many of them. So the government had this Russian Mi-46 copter, and they dropped us in a hot LZ at the top of a big hill where the country's only television station was. Man, we came in on that thing Ride of the Valkyries style, with just that one big red light at the top of that tower blinking at us. That big red eye looking right at us. We were supposed to secure it to keep it out of rebel hands, only when the three of us got there, about a half dozen rebels were hunkered down inside. We couldn't just frag or burn the place, so we shot it out with those guys. That was because when it was all over, the president of this country wanted to come up there and make a big speech over the TV to the whole country. He was that kind of guy. Chisholm got it right through the eye, so that was the end of that adventure. It wasn't like he had read about in those magazines. The other guy, whose name I forget, got shot in the leg. And it wouldn't have been so bad, but we didn't even have a piece of masking tape to put over that wound. We weren't ready for any resistance or much of anything. It was a half-assed thing we did, really. Eventually, they got bold and kept poking their heads out farther and farther, and finally we got lucky and shot two of them. Then the rest of them ran out the back door, down the hill, and I stormed in the front door by myself because the other dude had already died too. Bled straight out, and it shouldn't have happened. There wasn't anybody to lay down any covering fire, so I could go chase the SOBs that killed my buddy Chisholm. No revenge for me. Again, it's not like in the magazines. Inside wasn't much. There was a lobby with a couple of folding chairs, and then a studio about the size of a hotel room, and a room where all the machinery was. VCRs and stuff, all wired together. They still had their lunch set out in the lobby and a coffee pot on, and that came in damn handy real quick. I secured the area and waited for reinforcements. It was kind of funny. They had just loaded up all the VCR machines with movies, and they were running nonstop on that one TV channel. All the boxes looked like somebody walked out of a Blockbuster video back in the States and was racking up some hellacious fines. It was illegal looking as hell, but I guess running movies all day made the average person think the government was going to be okay. No need to panic, kind of thing. I guessed it wasn't going to turn out that way after all. I was up there a couple of days and nobody ever came up that hill. I sure learned a lot about those movies, though. Saw them over and over. At noon, played The Gods Must Be Crazy. Then at 2 p.m. was Love Brewed in the African Pot. And those were kind of boring. Then at 4 p.m. it kicked into high gear and they showed Shaft in Africa. Then at 6 p.m. they showed Savage Sisters. At 8 p.m., Black Mama, White Mama. Then at 10 p.m. was Blood Fist. And I love Don the Dragon Wilson, so I always watched that. Then at midnight was The Gods Must Be Crazy again, and it started all over. Y'all can have Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris or whoever. The Dragon had a legit fighting career of his own and made more movies too. And I have too much respect for those guys to try to guess who would win in a fight. It's stupid anyway because you would need 3 time machines to make it all work out, and that's never going to happen. Just watch the first Blood Fist movie. But after a couple of days of these movies playing over and over, I got pretty bored. So I looked all around the studio to see what there was to see. I'm pretty sure now what I thought was a big oil stain on the concrete floor of that studio was actually an old blood stain. In fact, I'm very sure of it. But what I was paying attention to at the time was this little hatch I saw on the floor. I opened it, and a ladder made out of what looked like scrap wood kind of leaned against the frame and was gone into the dark. I unsnapped a flashlight from my belt and thumbed it to life, shined it around down there. I saw that this ladder went down into a basement, actually more like a root cellar with dirt walls and everything. And there was a bunch of movies on shelves down there and a TV on a card table with its own little VCR. Of course, there were rats scurrying around everywhere, but they'd never bothered me that much. Dumb, I guess. I was hoping that's where they kept the booze or maybe the dope. Or hell, even some fresh vegetables like my grandma stored in her root cellar back in Indiana, way back in the day. Since none of that good stuff I was hoping for was down there, I decided maybe it's time to change up the programming. Maybe people out there hiding in their houses waiting for it to be over were sick of watching the same 5 or 6 movies too. Only when I started kind of ducking my head down there and looking at those shelves, these tapes all had handwritten labels, so I didn't know what was what. But like I said, bored. So I took one and I popped it in. At first I just thought it was a straight-up torture video that maybe the government had made. Political prisoners. You heard about that kind of stuff. It was for sure shot out the back door of the studio. There were guys in soldier uniforms and they had, I guess they were knives. A guy tied to something, not a chair, something else. It wasn't all made of bones, but some of it was. Only now I realize it wasn't torture so much, it was a ritual. I was damn glad I never saw that bone couch or whatever it was around there anywhere. Where they kept that thing, I hope I never know. I had seen some bad stuff by then in Iraq, but I got sick of this pretty quick and tried to shut it off. Only I couldn't get the VCR to quit. So I unplugged it from the wall and it still didn't stop. The pictures kept playing that I couldn't unsee and the sounds. So eventually I just backed up the ladder and pulled the ladder up behind me and shut the hatch, and I rolled one of those TV tripod camera things over the hatch. But I could hear the sounds coming up through the floor. And that blue flickering light from those old TVs showing around the cracks. Even when I went out into the lobby, those sounds were right under my feet. A man dying, evil men laughing, the scrape of bone, the whispers of knives. And that was messed up because that root cellar wasn't that big. It sure wasn't under the lobby, but I heard it just as clearly as when I was pushing that tripod over that hatch. Well, that was a long-ass night, and I couldn't wait until morning. Only, morning didn't come. It stayed dark, and I noticed my watch had stopped. So I'm not exactly sure how long that period of time was, but it was a long time. And the threads started coming loose. And I guess at some point I just fired my M16 into the darkness until I ran out of bullets. And that was a stupid thing to do, to run out of bullets when there are still voices and darkness. Because I knew that in that endless dark, I was going to need some weapons. What I thought I was going to do with those weapons, except for shoot at more shadows, I don't really know. But I was still a soldier then, first and foremost. I knew Chisholm and the other guys' guns were where they fell. Same with the 2 guys we killed. Plus, I thought I saw those rebels throw down some Chinese knockoffs of Mr. Kalashnikov's beautiful AK-47s when they were tearing ass away. And of course, there were knives and machetes and toenail clippers and everything else just lying around everywhere. The first step out that front door was the hardest, but those sounds and voices fell away, and that was something. And the dark wasn't too bad at first. I could see a bit and didn't have to feel around too much, which is good because when that hot wind blew a little bit your direction, it didn't smell good. You can figure out why. So I was doing okay, all things considered, getting my little armory together. But then Chisholm stepped out in front of me, right out of the darkness. For a crazy second, I thought somehow he'd survived that bullet, even though he still had a hole where his left eye should have been, and not much back of his forehead. He said a lot of stuff to me I won't repeat, mostly because he gave me a righteous ass chewing, which I deserved, but the one thing I will say is he told me a lot of blood had been spilled right there, and that something woke up. Something woke up. And that plays into what happened next. He was right. Of all the stupid things I did when we hit the LZ, leaving a bunch of dead guys laying around, showing no respect for the dead, especially my own dead. Man, I just remembered that other dude's name was Cord. So I thought I was going down Christmas Carol style when the second ghost stepped out from around the building, and it wasn't Cord like you'd think. It was Don the Dragon Wilson, and he was not dead then, and is actually not dead now either, so I think I was losing it a bit at that point, in case you couldn't guess. But I told the dragon to make more of those Blood Fist movies because I loved the first one, and he ended up making 6 or 7 more, so I gotta think what was real that night and what wasn't. That long night. He made a lot of those movies. I'm just saying, he made a lot of them. I went back down inside before I saw a third ghost. I'd killed 2 other guys who were just lying there, and there was a whole shelf full of videotapes. And where they put the pieces and parts of those victims from those tapes, I had no idea. I don't know if victim is the right word, but sacrifice. I don't know. It sounds like something you just give into. And I'll give it to those dudes. They went down fighting. Screaming, but they were fighting too. I was locked and loaded in that TV station, but those sounds kept coming out from under the studio, and there weren't enough guns and knives to chase that away. I started thinking, was I better off hiding out there in the TV station or taking my chances out in that darkness? That tells you how bad it was, where my head was at. It wasn't long after those thoughts I started hearing something I knew wasn't off that tape that wouldn't quit playing. I guess the right word would be, it was a murmur, a murmuring. Man, that's a funny word. Murmuring. It was almost like it was right in my skull, behind my eyes kind of thing. I'm not exactly sure, but I think it was a day or maybe 2 days later when I figured out what it wanted me to do. And it took me, I think, about another day to decide I was going to do it. So when I did, I tied a belt below my elbow and picked up the sharpest machete I could find. My first thought was I could just sacrifice a finger, maybe 2 fingers, but if it wasn't enough, if it wasn't satisfied, then I didn't know if I had the guts to swing that knife down a second time. That voice, if you could say it was a voice, was more than a murmur at this point. It was getting damned loud, in fact. So when I finally brought that machete down, I took the whole hand. Behind me, out of the TV, Richard Roundtree said, "Look, why don't you get rid of that jolly giant over there?" And then I passed out. When I woke, the sun was up. A big red sun. Never been happier to see one. There was blood everywhere, but just a little more inside me than outside me, and I learned it was just enough. I left everything. I didn't take a gun or a machete or a pocket knife or a toothpick. I walked down off that hill and passed a whole army on the way, but whether they were more rebels or the government troops, I don't remember. I passed through them all like a ghost, and nobody even looked at me. I walked a long way, and finally, it was far enough away that everything I saw and heard was more or less behind me. And that country was coming apart at the seams, but neither man nor beast gave me a second look. Maybe I was the third ghost. I grabbed a KA-60 transport plane out of there and then caught a flight into Lagos. When I got back to the States, I got pretty drunk, and then I went down to Iowa where Chisholm was from. And if you think this story is unbelievable, you should have heard the story I told Chisholm's mother about how he died. More like how he lived and fought and killed 100 rebels. And before that, he personally made Saddam Hussein pee his pants and run away. Instead of telling her that we didn't do much in Desert Storm but drive around, and he was a merc for about 5 minutes before he got shot right in the head. And he just lay there dead until he got up and talked to me, and then he just laid there dead again, and I assume he got rolled down the hill into some mass grave or something. That whole place was a mass grave, and I don't doubt that that's why it doesn't exist anymore. Nobody around to remember that place or what it was called. After Iowa, I went back to Indiana and got a job selling cars. And man, if I thought I was around stone killers and crazy people before, this car selling business, it ain't for the weak. You know, for a minute I thought about getting a hook on this stump and maybe getting back into it, into the mercenary game. And then I was like, come on, man, a hook? Hey, do you want another drink? No? Hey, that's okay. I'm going to hang out a little while longer, maybe go to an after-hours joint after this. These guys at the VA let me know about a couple places, like this warehouse where at night, old guys are in the back playing records and they sell you beers out of a cooler, blankets over the windows, you know. People there all night, dancing and dressed up and everything. It's crazy, man. But sometimes I need an all-night scene. Yeah, because there are nights... there are nights where this stump aches and I hear those voices under my feet again. And blue lights flickering like TVs don't even make anymore, really. And you know, the murmurs The murmuring right in the back of my damn coconut head. And I just want to stay up, and make sure the sun comes up again in the morning. Just in case, you know. Survivors by Shane Migliavacca. The girl stared at the picture of her mother. She was only a baby in the photo, her mom holding her tight and smiling. The girl was only 1 when the world ended. Her mom died then, in the ensuing chaos. She was 15 now. Her father had escaped the city with her, raised her out here in the middle of nowhere. They lived in a cabin surrounded by beautiful trees. He taught her how to read, to hunt, to survive. She could hear the thunk of the axe outside. He was cutting some firewood. It was a comforting sound. They'd need that wood soon. Fall's chill was heavy in the air. She loved the smell of burning wood, curling up by the fire and reading a book. Father had brought a bunch of books with him. He'd brought a few more back on a recent supply run. The girl hoped someday he'd let her come along on one. But there was only the 2 of them. He told her that someone needed to guard the cabin and their stuff. There were scavengers out there, people like them, but willing to hurt and kill others to get what they want. Worse than the scavengers were the dead. They were the ones that destroyed everything. Dead bodies returned to life. They attacked the living, ate their flesh. One bite from them, even a scratch, and you'd get sick and turn into one of them. That's what happened to Mom. She'd seen some pictures of them Dad had shown her. Terrible-looking things, a shiver ran down her spine just thinking about those pictures. There was always a risk those things could show up here. The girl felt nervous. She got up from her chair and went over to the window. From here, she could see her father working. Her dad brought down the axe, splitting a large piece of wood. His face was sweaty. He was starting to grow a beard. She didn't like him with the beard. It hid his smile. He said it kept his face warm in the winter. Her dad looked up and saw her watching. He waved. The girl waved back. Just seeing him, she felt reassured. There wasn't much to do right now. She'd washed the dishes from breakfast. It was too early to think about making lunch. They had a good garden going here. She'd gotten pretty good at gardening. Her dad had learned it from Mom and later from Mom's books. The same books the girl read growing up. They, along with the photo, made her feel still connected to her mother. Dad didn't talk much about her. It made him too sad. She could see it in his eyes. Besides the garden, they hunted the local wildlife for food. There were deer, turkey, rabbits, and squirrels. She'd gone a few times, but as good as they tasted, she couldn't bring herself to shoot one. Dad had been disappointed, mainly, he said, because he feared what would happen if he wasn't around. This always led her to getting upset, so he dropped it. Now he went hunting by himself. She was better at setting traps for the smaller ones. At least she didn't have to be there for those when it happened. When they died. Her dad checked the traps once or twice a day. Mostly they just got squirrels. They made a good stew meat. Dad said they tasted a bit like pork, something they didn't have anymore around here. He said maybe someday they'd get lucky and find a wild pig. There was some time before it would be lunchtime. She didn't really want to stay in the cabin all day. It was too nice outside. A little chilly maybe, but the morning sun was warming things up. Maybe she could convince Dad to let her go check the traps. It would be a nice walk and a chance to get some fresh air. The cabin tended to get a little stuffy. If she was going to convince her father, she needed to get equipped. The girl went over to the wall of weapons. That was her name for it anyway. On the gun rack sat their hunting rifle and a shotgun. Underneath on a table sat a bow and a bunch of arrows. Next to them was her pistol, sitting in its holster. If Dad had his way, she'd wear the gun all the time, even to bed. The girl picked the holster up, taking the gun out and checking it. Loaded and ready to go. She took the belt with the holster and fastened the buckle. It felt tight against her waist. The girl took a sheath with a knife that was setting on the table. Couldn't forget that. She tied it to her leg. Then she slid on her flannel jacket, putting a handful of rounds in one pocket. Now all she needed to do was convince her father. After promising her father about 50 times she'd be careful and keep to the route, the girl got to go. He offered to go with her, but after telling him she wanted to do it herself, he relented. The girl wouldn't have minded her dad's company at all, but they spent so much time together in the cabin it was nice to have some time all to herself. Besides, she was getting older, it was time she had more responsibility. As she headed out, the girl could still hear a few birds chirping away in the trees. There were some that hadn't left yet. She hoped they'd be okay. The brush crunched under her boots. The trees had started losing their leaves. They looked so beautiful this time of year, with the orange and red leaves. It was a shame they couldn't look that way all year round. She heard a distant rumble in the sky. Looking up, she saw the great bird far up in the clouds. Father told her about them. They soared through the skies, letting out a great roar. Their bodies sparkled with lights, leaving a great trail of smoke behind them as they went. The girl stared up in awe. She followed after, waving her arms and calling to it. Not that it could see or hear her way down on the ground as it flew through the heavens. It reminded the girl of one of the dragons in the books she read. Tales of great warriors fighting mighty beasts, all for fair princesses. Then the warrior and the princess would go off together, happily ever after. The stories always end with that. What was happily ever after? Sometimes the books had pictures. The girl would look at the pictures of the handsome warrior and feel odd. She dare not tell her father. The feelings made her feel embarrassed. Sometimes she dreamed about those warriors. The ground gave way underneath her. The girl went tumbling down a hill, crashing through some brush. Leaves and branches scraped her face and hands as she rolled down the hill, coming to a sudden stop in a small ditch. The girl could feel blood trickle down her cheek. She stood, feeling dumb. She'd done what her father always warned her about, lost focus. She'd been so caught up with watching the great bird and daydreaming. The girl felt sore and had some cuts, but she was lucky to be alive. She turned, looking up at the hill she'd just came down. It was quite steep. It was a miracle she didn't break anything. More than the physical pain, she felt ashamed. Ashamed she'd let her father's faith in her down. The girl started back up the hill, but the dirt was too loose. All she could manage was to get a little ways up before sliding back down. Finally giving up, she used a few of the words her father told her not to. She'd have to find another way back. The girl looked around. A sliver of fear ran through her belly. She'd never been here before. She touched the gun at her side, reassured by its cold surface and weight against her hip. There was nothing to fear if she remembered what her father had taught her. Keep her head and stay on the goal. She started walking, looking for a way around, or maybe an easier place to climb, her eyes scanning the terrain as the girl made her way through the woods. A sound stopped her. It was a man's voice, gruff-sounding, not at all like her dad's. It sounded mean, violent. "Keep your eyes open, Dale," it said, saying the name with anger. The girl's heart started to beat fast. That sliver of fear started to multiply. Another voice, younger, answered him. I am. The girl crouched low and crept forward. She wanted to get a look at these intruders, size them up. Did they know her and her dad were there? Did they come to take their supplies? She hid behind a large fallen tree. Long dead, and its roots looked like the mouth of an angry monster. Peeking over the tree carcass, she saw them. There were 3 of them. The gruff-sounding one was the oldest. Then there was another male, about her age it looked. Then a boy, the one he called Dale, maybe 12 or 13 years old. The girl eased along the dead trees as they moved forward. She needed to stay behind some cover. Slowly, she drew her pistol, taking the safety off with a click. Unless she ambushed them, they had the advantage with the rifles. They had the benefit of distance on their side. They'd have to come closer for her to get a good shot. So she waited, breathing heavily, sweat dripping down her forehead, mixing with the blood from the scratches. The girl wiped her forehead, leaving a greasy, bloody smear across it. "You have to be careful with that rifle, son," the older man said, sounding a bit annoyed, yet fatherly. Were these his sons? "Out here, you could hurt yourself on one of us, and there's nobody to help." It reminded her of her own training. Maybe they were good people. Maybe if she called out to them, approached them, they could be friends. No. She remembered what her father had told her about the others. They only wanted everything for themselves. Looking at the lanky older man, she could believe it. He had a look about him, something that told her to stay away. They'd most likely shoot her and go after her dad and their stuff. She could just let them pass, stay hidden, but if they kept heading the way they were, they'd find the cabin. There was every chance her dad might come looking for her, stumble into these three. They might gun him down without a thought. The girl had to act. What would father do, she thought? How would he handle it if they'd switched places? The girl didn't want to kill them, especially the boy. They were just trying to survive like her. Maybe she could lead them away, get them to chase her, get them going in the other direction, away from their home. Adrenaline started flowing through her veins as the girl got ready. Just let them get a little closer. Her body tensed with nervous energy. She had to protect her home, her father. A tingling feeling shot through her body. Instinct took over as she bolted from her hiding place, squeezing off 2 controlled shots, ripping through the calm, quiet morning. The first shot was a warning to scare them. The second hit the older man in the arm, grazing it. This shot was to get them to come after her. "Down! Down!" the youngest son screamed. "Daddy!" the younger boy called out. Terror filled his voice. The girl crashed through the underbrush. The crack of a rifle. A bullet smashed into the tree she just passed. She pumped her legs, zigzagging between trees. Another rifle crack. This time, nowhere close. 10 feet ahead of her was a slight rocky slope. The girl scrambled up to it. The sharp rocks dug into her hands as she used them to pull herself up the slope. Somewhere behind her, another rifle blast, this one zinging off a rock. The girl ran, then walked, then ran again. After a while, the sun was lower in the sky. It was afternoon now. It was getting darker. Were they still following? Or had she lost them? The only thing she knew for sure was that she was lost. Lost and tired. She stopped, sitting down on a tree stump. The girl was thirsty. If she'd only taken a canteen with her. Lost, tired, and thirsty. The girl started to weep. After a few minutes of crying, she got frustrated with herself. Using her sleeve, she wiped the tears from her burning eyes. She stood, licking her lips for the moisture from the tears. The girl's throat hurt from crying, making her even thirstier. Water. The stream. Yes! The one they used for their water. Dad had told her if she got lost, look for it. It would lead her home. Just find the stream, she thought. The girl searched fruitlessly for the stream for an hour or more. She felt more lost now than earlier. It was hopeless. The woods were endless. She wasn't even scared anymore, just defeated. Defeated and tired. How long has it been since she ate anything? The girl yawned. Her head was spinning a bit. Maybe a little nap, just to clear her head, recharge her energy. The girl sat, leaning her head against a tree. The air was getting cold as the sun went down. Hugging herself to keep warm, the girl's eyes felt heavy. Just a quick nap, she told herself. That's all she needed. Closing her eyes, she let sleep take her. A beast roared through the woods, startling the girl from her brief nap. What sort of animal made that kind of noise? Did those men bring it with them, using it to hunt her down? Red, white, and blue lights danced over the trees, casting an unearthly glow look over the woods. Curious, she got up, advancing through the trees ahead of her. Moving slowly, she gripped her pistol tight, pushing past the group of trees and brush. She found herself on a long stretch of what once was a road. Father had told her about roads and cars. People used to use them to travel back and forth all the time, before everything had ended. There was nothing here. No beast. Nothing. What had made that sound? Farther down the road, she saw something moving, coming her way. Bright light coming from it. White, red, blue, swirling, dancing, same as before. She darted back into the cover of the trees as the thing drew closer. It made a high, wailing sound as it passed by. It was followed by two more. She caught brief glimpses of their insides as they sped by. There were people inside. Were these cars? Dad had told her there was no more gas to power them. How was this possible? The girl waited until she was sure no more were coming before stepping out onto the road again. She stood at its center, looking one way, then the next. The last rays of sunlight were slowly fading away. It would be dark soon. The cold air on her skin woke her up from her haze. The girl felt reinvigorated. She could do this. Listening to the birds chirping away in the trees, singing their song, there was another sound there under them. A familiar rhythm. Water. Without thinking, she rushed to the other side of the road. There, down at the bottom of the dirt embankment, was a stream. Maybe the stream, if she followed it back, it might lead her home. Or, she thought, looking down the road, where those things had come from, she could go there. Maybe there were more people there. Good people. People that could help her get back to her dad. The road or the stream? After a few moments of thought, the girl headed down the embankment toward the stream. She cupped her hands and gulped down some water. It was cold, but tasted good. The stream ran parallel to the road for a bit before curving off further into the woods. After all, could she really trust anyone? No. She'd find her way home, to her father, on her own. Thanksgiving Dinner by Rachel Ridolfi, a Weekly Spooky original. Monticello, Indiana. Just an hour and a half from the infamous Gary, and still less than 3 hours from Chicago. It was a small town with a population that barely scratched 5,000 men, women, and children. Most residents grew up together, worked together, went to school together. Hell, most of them even frequented the same 5 churches. That's why, when Sophia got the chance to move, she chose Monticello. Just close enough to home that she could visit her family if she chose to, but usually she chose not to. She loved her family, but they were a thorn in her side. Chicago wasn't quite her speed. There was just too much going on all the time, and she just couldn't cope with all of that. Not anymore. Aside from being constantly high-strung from all the work she had to do for the city, she also found herself increasingly depressed dealing with the less-than-responsible members of her precinct. With the recommendation of her chief, and with a little bit of finagling when a position opened up, Sophia got herself a cushy job in Monticello, Indiana. She considered it cushy because she really didn't have to do much or deal with much, aside from the odd noise complaint or writing your standard parking tickets. Sure, in the summer she would have to work a little harder to control traffic or stave off the common drunken tourist, but for the most part, she really didn't have to work that hard. It really felt like the only time she was working was May through August. Once the chilly September air hit, everything quieted down and she got a chance to relax. Sitting in her cruiser, she got a text on her phone. "Are you coming or not?" the text message from her brother bellowed. Sophia grimaced at her phone, sighed, and stretched out. It had been a long shift already. She really didn't feel like dealing with her family. She glanced at a picture on her dashboard before opening up her phone and responding. "No, I'm not coming. The drive is too long," she tapped back. 3 dots. Someone honked across the street, and she glanced up. One elderly driver was taking too long to make a left turn at a light. She decided to ignore it. The response finally chimed. "Dinner starts at 6. Just say you don't want to see us." "Okay, fine, I don't want to see you," she hastily pounded back, then hit send. She was working a double anyway. Chief Lewis called off sick and she'd taken his shift. Even if she wanted to see her family, she couldn't. Her black coffee gave off big puffs of heat vapor. She took a huge, scolding gulp and hissed, "Fucker," at her phone before glancing back up at traffic. The picture on her dashboard glowered at her in monochromatic tones. The elderly driver had figured out the problem and traffic was moving along fine. It was never busy during noon anyway, but during the holiday season it was so slow she could almost take a nap. Another ding. She glanced at the home screen of her phone, which had the banner of, "But Grandma really misses you, her and Mom." She honestly debated opening up that message. It had been a whole year since her brother had attempted an honest-to-God conversation with her. She was curious to see what he would try to pull this time.
"Officer Cortez, please report."
A familiar and friendly voice chimed. Nancy was always too polite. If she didn't end a call with "please," Sophia would be suspicious. "Officer Cortez reporting," Sophia said back.
"We have a request for a welfare check at 1911 East Davidson, please,"
Nancy said. Sophia plugged it into her GPS. It was less than 3 miles away.
"Now this one here is a doozy,"
Nancy continued.
"Probably should have just called animal control, if you please."
Officer Cortez talked back through the receiver. "If you needed animal control, you should have just called them. Why am I going here?"
"Well, to be honest,"
Nancy droned. If she wasn't droning, something was wrong.
"perfectly honest, mind you, the animal isn't of the utmost concern."
"All right then, so what is?"
"Norman Roberts. He ain't been in contact with his neighbor and his dog is still outside, if you please. Abigail White called and said he hadn't been seen in over 12 days.
Sophia started her car and the engine of her cruiser grumbled to life when she followed the directions on her GPS.
"Oh good, you are going. I'll let Chief Lewis know he don't need to go all the way down there,"
Nancy said. Sophia paused, furrowed her brows, hissed into the radio. "You didn't disturb him, did you?"
"Oh, I've been keeping him updated on all activity in the town."
Nancy chortled back cheerily. Sophia sighed, pinched her brow at a stop sign and groaned. "Let him know I'm handling it, and then just stop, please. He needs his rest."
"Oh, sure,"
Nancy chirped. Sophia headed forward and followed the directions on her phone.
"I guess chemo ain't easy after all,"
the dispatcher noted. "No, it's not," Sophia reassured, trying not to look at the picture of her father. Sophia took a turn, waited at a traffic light, and took another sip of her coffee. Well-paved roads gave way to gravel as she headed towards the trailer park. The soy fields were barren and empty. A corpse of oak trees with vibrant orange leaves towered near a fence line, and a few crows glowered at her from their perch on the phone lines. The road was bumpy, and her cruiser had a rough time hopping over all the potholes. Monticello was doing well, but not well enough to buy new SUVs for the police or repave all the roads. And even as well as the city was doing, it still had its rough areas, just like any city around the world. Sophia just counted herself lucky that this particular city didn't have many of the other issues as elsewhere in the country. While driving past a barren grove of trees, her phone chimed again. Another message from her brother, this time insisting, "Dad would want you here." That almost set her off. Feeling the blood pounding hard in her arms and burning the sense of rage in her chest, she paused, took a deep breath, and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She released the breath, glanced at the picture of her father in uniform she kept in the car, and scowled, grumbling to herself. "Now he's trying to use you against me." She wouldn't dignify her brother's harassment with a response. She turned a corner at the entrance of the trailer park and followed each left-hand turn until she came to the address she was looking for. An elderly woman, definitely past her 70s, rushed out of a trailer and swarmed Sophia's SUV. "Are you here for Norm?" the woman asked. Sophia nodded, stepped out from the car with hardly a glance at the photo, and considered leaving her phone in the car, but then thought better of it. If this was an emergency, she would want her phone, and if it wasn't, well, it was still set on vibrate and wouldn't disturb her. The woman, Abigail bombarded Sophia with a tirade of information. "I've been waiting for what seems like forever. It's Thanksgiving now, and Norm promised to have dinner with me. He always promises but rarely keeps them. Almost 2 weeks ago, though, I made him swear on his mama's grave he'd come for Thanksgiving dinner with me, and he ain't said a word." Sophia nodded, took out her notepad, and wrote down any pertinent information she could discern. There was none. "So the last time you spoke to Norman was 12 days ago?" she asked. "Yes, 12 days ago," Abigail confirmed, with a nod. "He'd just got home from a long haul and promised me a visit today." Sophia closed the door of her car with a slam, and immediately a cacophony of barks sounded from behind the trailer. Within a few moments, the entire park was filled with warning howls of dogs. "He does that when anyone comes over," Abigail explained, pointing at the small yard behind the trailer. "He's been chained up this whole time." "For almost 2 weeks?" "Yeah, I just been giving him food and water," Abigail explained, looking rather sheepish. Sophia grimaced before the yelping died down, and only the baying of Norman's hound remained. "Have you tried contacting Norman directly?" she pried. Abigail nodded. "I banged on the door, both front and back, and he ain't said nothin'," she explained. "I called him last week, but it went straight to voicemail." Sophia nodded and glanced over at Norman's trailer. None of the other trailers were in the best of shape, but his was the most worn down. The paint had peeled off of practically every inch. All of the windows had been broken and replaced with plywood. The front door itself was held in place with a patchwork of duct tape and bungee cords. The trailer sat at nearly a 45-degree angle at the left corner because the foundation had settled unevenly. She noted a security camera duct taped just above the front door, and she assumed on instinct there was a twin on the other side of the house. She didn't mention this to Abigail. Officer Cortez took a step forward and asked, "So when was the last time you spoke to him directly?" Abigail's answer finally raised enough alarm that Sophia had to write down the answer. "Just about 3 weeks ago, right before he went on the road." Noting it and raising an eyebrow, Sophia took another step forward, and the dog in the backyard began to growl again. Another noise, like a dog growling but very muffled, caught her ear. Sophia nodded and asked, "Does he travel often?" "Every week," Abigail said, as Sophia took another few steps toward the front door. "He's a trucker." Both nodded. Abigail, finding a sense of urgency, yelled back at the dog, "Hush your face, Hank!" The dog out back whimpered, then shut up, while the near-silent grumbling indoors still continued. The wind picked up and changed direction, and Sophia's nose wrinkled when she caught an acrid, metallic scent. "Been stinking like that for almost a week," Abigail said, seeing her face. "Don't smell good, but it's not a gas leak." "No," Sophia agreed. "Definitely not a gas leak." She took a step up onto the porch, and the dog began barking again. The smell definitely wasn't gas, but it wasn't good. It was bittersweet and smelled of decomposition. It was the smell of death. And she knew it. She'd smelled it before, when her father passed. "And you've tried contacting him directly," Sophia pressed, trying to be heard above the hound, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Abigail nodded. "Every day at 3 p.m. when the mail comes." Sophia nodded. Opening the door, the smell was undeniable. Decomposing flesh was somewhere nearby. Over the howling barks of the dog, she could still hear that growling noise. The door creaked open. The dog whimpered and then fell silent. But the growling continued. "Norman Roberts?" she called into the trailer. No answer. "This is Officer Cortez with Monticello PD?" Still nothing but the faint growling and the hum of a TV. The living room housed an old TV, still running ads. A dilapidated recliner with a bowl of popcorn. Flies buzzed around the bowl, then dispersed as she walked forward. The room itself was sparse. There was furniture, a TV stand, and a TV, a recliner, even a bookshelf, but no books or decorations. No pictures, no posters, not even a loose receipt. Every step she took echoed around that blank room. The growling grew louder, but Sophia couldn't place where it was coming from. First, she searched the room to her right, a bedroom. She walked slightly uphill against the setting foundation, boards creaking underfoot. The bed wasn't a real bed. It lacked a frame and was really only a mattress on the floor. A line, a nylon cord like the kind used to contain a dog, was bolted to the floor near the mattress and extended to the doorframe of the room. No pictures or anything to make the room homey, just the mattress and the cord. The windows were enclosed with boards, nailed from the inside. Hank, the dog, began to whimper when he heard the floorboards creak. Sophia called back to the station. "Nancy, I need you to stay on the line with me." Her eyes followed the cord from the far end of the room to the door she was standing at, and she could still hear Hank's whimpering, now an excited yelping, as well as the constant grumbling. In that bare bedroom, there was a closet to her left and a dresser to her right. She considered searching either of them, but since this was only a welfare check, she decided against it. She doubled back and paced through the living room, the ad on TV proclaiming it could cure any subscriber of all credit card debts, while the growling grew louder. Little hairs on Sophia's neck prickled, and she could feel her heart begin to speed up. Something wasn't right. When she came to the doorway for the next room, Hank's yelping silenced, and so did the growling. For a brief moment, the only things she could hear were the pounding of her own heart and the TV switching over to sports commentary. The kitchen had no natural light. Every single window in the trailer was covered, and there were no other lights aside from the TV. In the darkest corner to her left, something shuffled. "Hello?" No answer. "Norman Roberts, this is Officer Cortez. I've been called for a welfare check?" Still nothing. She took a step forward and counted her heartbeats to the count of 5. 1, 2, 3. A shadow pounced forward from the corner and reached toward her, hissing. Sophia took one step back and pulled her gun from its holster, shouting, "This is Officer Cortez with Monticello PD!" The cord around the goblin's neck caught it and stopped in midair, crashing it to the ground. Hank began whimpering again, and when the goblin hissed at Sophia, the dog howled. "Nancy, I need backup now," Sophia said into her radio, taking a few steps back. The gaunt figure paced on all fours, tugging against its leash. It stopped hissing and then growled like a dog, ready to strike when it got the chance. The goblin barked at her thrice, then sat on its haunches, head tucked between its shoulders, and glowered at her. It attempted to pull against the collar around its neck to no avail, so it stumbled back on all fours to its corner and grabbed an object and began chewing on it. Then the smell hit her. Decomposing flesh and death and the tangy scent of some kind of infection. The goblin screamed at her, then went back to gnawing its bone. An arm. An entire human arm. Sophia glanced to the right end of the kitchen in the trailer and saw the main source of the stench. The bloated corpse of a man with one missing arm, slouched over the table, only barely out of reach from the naked goblin. Scratch and bite marks riddled his body. The creature hissed, shrieked, and then charged her again. Its lithe and lanky frame was caught by the nylon cord in midair and fell to the ground for a second time. The broken eyes of a human child glanced at her beneath the matted hair on its head. Officer Cortez fled the scene, never mind what her father would have thought, and emptied the contents of her stomach in front of Abigail. They both waited for reinforcements. The second officer arrived. The baying of hounds filled the air, and 90 seconds after entering the trailer, he fled as well. 2 more officers were called in. Then they called in the EMT, the coroner, animal services, and child protective services. It took only 30 minutes to extract the dog, Hank, a full-blooded, unneutered male German shepherd. He nearly mauled one of the animal control officers, and they assumed he would have to be put down. The goblin, however... Officer Cortez couldn't leave the scene despite how much she wanted to. Abigail made coffee for everyone, except Sophia, who got a cup of tea and accepted it without argument. Abigail kept her arm wrapped around Sophia while the other officers extracted the remaining suspect? Victim? No one was really able to tell at that point. Whatever it was, they had to sedate it just to move it from the scene. It wasn't a goblin apprehended from the scene, but a child. And after she was sedated and carted off with the EMTs, Sophia had to stick around with the investigators to explain what she'd seen. And then, because she was covering for Chief Lewis, follow up the rest of the investigation. As her instincts predicted, Animal Control found another security camera facing the backyard when they caught Hank. CPS found a camera in the kitchen while they were trapping the child. Officers found another camera in the bedroom, hidden in a corner where Sophia couldn't see. Chains and nylon cords everywhere. Whips, handcuffs, and muzzles for both dogs and humans in the bedroom and kitchen. That night, on the drive home, after everything was revealed, Sophia talked to her father via the picture of him she kept on her dashboard. As she talked, she reflected on what she'd seen. She couldn't stay stoic like her father had been, and she'd been finding herself discovering more and more differences between the two of them. At home, she actually called her mother and explained what had happened. Further investigation was required, and searching around the house found even more evidence of more torture to the child. Cages that were too small for Hank, more restraints and tethers. Physically, the child looked to be 8. That was almost a relief to everyone involved. Then a researcher found medical records that Norman Roberts had a wife that died in childbirth 19 years ago. But even the county coroner couldn't find a death certificate for the baby. The next week, Chief Lewis took a turn for the worst and Sophia had to helm the investigation. She was there the day the investigators found something strange in the backyard and began to dig. At the end of the day, they'd recovered bones from corpses of 4 different children, all aged between 5 and 11. The graves were unmarked and bore all appearances of just simply being holes Norman dug just to dump the evidence. Digging under the trailer showed dozens of external hard drives, the source of the slump in the foundation, constituting days of footage, documenting the torture of children. Sophia herself had to search records for missing children and eventually found 4 missing person reports that all coincided with the apparent ages of the children. She made Nancy make calls to the families. That night, she called her brother, and talking about everything she was seeing, they'd managed to go 30 minutes without an argument. Searching the bedroom eventually turned up a laptop with over a decade worth of footage. Most of it had been scrubbed, but there were highlight reels from over the years, and at least 6 months of security footage. The security footage was mostly hours and hours of nothing, just Hank barking out back or Abigail standing at the front door. But sometimes Norman would go out back to fetch Hank, and that coincided with the highlight reel, which were almost exclusively Norman chaining down the girl in the bedroom, then encouraging the dog to have his way with her. Each day, a new horror from the case awaited Sophia. Norman had initially kept a cadre of 5 children in his home, only one of them related to him. Over time, all of them had died off but one. No one in the community had reported anything wrong because they didn't think there was much wrong with a grown man blocking out his windows and keeping secrets. A month later, and Sophia had learned that the remaining child was really Norman Roberts' own progeny, with his wife really dying in childbirth. Shortly after the death of his wife, he had adopted 4 other children and then, Highlander style, chained them up in the house and systematically starved them to see who would survive the longest. Videos showed a marked change in his torture of the children when he acquired Hank. The dog was eventually put down, and normally Sophia would feel kind of bad for an innocent animal getting caught up in crime like this, but after the footage she saw, she couldn't feel bad. Toxicology reports of Norman Roberts showed that when he died, he had a bad heart and had taken too many pills for erectile dysfunction. It was a simple case of trying to make himself too horny when his heart couldn't take it. He died at the kitchen table, and the only thing that had saved his daughter was the fact that his arm was just close enough she was able to rip it off, and use it for sustenance before Officer, now Chief, Cortez had arrived. The girl had no name. She had no story other than what the investigators could discover. She didn't have a way to explain what had happened. She had nothing. She was nearly 20 years old, trapped forever in the body of a malnourished 8-year-old, with the mind of a beast. And that was about it. Sophia wished she could keep track of the child, but honestly, that's not what Chief Lewis would have done. And even if her father would have followed up, he was dead now, so it really didn't matter. Over the course of this investigation, she learned that she admired him, but she was nothing like him. Sophia Cortez would never be the same. A month later, Chief Cortez got a text on her phone. "Are you going to be here or not?" her brother asked. She tapped back. "I'll be there in time for dinner," she thought, then added, "just like Dad would want."
Homecoming by Joe Salmo.
Brandon pulled the keyring from his pocket of the worn blue jeans he wore. Christy danced impatiently from foot to foot behind him in the cold morning air. "Hurry up, Brandon, it's freezing out here," she said as a cloud of her frozen breath escaped her mouth. "First thing we're going to do is have to get these locks changed. This key isn't working right," Brandon said over his shoulder back at his fiancée. "I just hope the heat is turned on. I can't believe you went out and got us a house without letting me see it first," she said and rubbed her arms. "It's more romantic that way. Besides, it's all my money," Brandon said as the key finally did its job and the lock clicked. He swung the door open and turned towards Christy. "Shall I carry you over the threshold?" he asked. "Not until we're married, Bran. Let's just get warm," Christy said and pushed past him. He heard her boots click on the hardwood floors of the living room. "This place is huge," he heard her say from deep within the house. It put a smile on his face that she liked the house he picked out. He entered and closed the door behind him. "How much did you pay for this place, Bran?" she asked as he entered the kitchen behind her. She ran her hands over the granite countertop. It was so smooth. "Now don't you worry about that," he replied and wrapped his arms around her. She squealed and started to giggle. "How can we afford this place?" "I got it all covered. I've been saving up for a while now. If I take some overtime down at the shop every week, we should be just fine. I talked to Sam. He said I could work Saturdays," Brandon said. "It's beautiful." "When do we move in?" she asked. "As soon as we're done here, I got the truck for the whole day," he said back. "This is going to be great. We can start a family," Brandon finished. She smiled back at him and kissed him on the mouth, making a loud smacking noise with her lips when they separated. "Let's go. You know I don't have much at my mom's," she said and skipped towards the front door. Brandon watched her go. It wasn't just to see her backside, although it was quite impressive. It was her youthfulness that really attracted him to her. They had met in high school. He was a senior, but she was only a freshman. They didn't really talk until Christy's mom had to bring her car into the shop Brandon worked at after graduation. They were nearly inseparable ever since. He followed her out the door. Night fell across the town early in the wintertime. It was only 6:30 p.m., but the streetlights have come on already when they pulled up in Sam's borrowed truck full of their possessions. Brandon backed it right up to the front door so they didn't have to walk as far. "Come on, babe, let's get this stuff inside. We need to christen each room, you know," Brandon said, patting Christy on the behind. "Once we get this stuff inside, I'm gonna be too tired," she said, and watched the smile leave Brandon's face. "Well, maybe 2 rooms," she said coyly. They carried the boxes inside and placed them in the rooms which were labeled on them. They didn't have much in the way of furniture. They were using lawn chairs temporarily in the living room. It would take another week or so for Brandon to get enough money to get a couch from one of those rental places. "You know, Bran, I was thinking now that we have our own house, that maybe I should get a job," Christy said as she placed a milk crate down in the living room. Brandon placed the TV on top of it. At least they had a flat screen and not one of those old heavy TVs, he thought to himself. "I'll bring the truck back tomorrow. Why don't we order a pizza and get cleaned up?" Brandon said, kissing his fiancée. "Sounds good to me. I could use a hot shower," Christy said, and headed upstairs. Brandon ordered a pizza quick and followed her up. He could hear the shower running as he entered their bedroom. He started to assemble the wooden frame before he lacked all ambition. He just finished when he heard a knock on the door. He raced downstairs to get the pizza. After they were full, they made their way to the bedroom. He was glad he'd finished putting the bed together. They hopped onto the mattress and started to get undressed. Brandon awoke sometime in the night. He sat up and looked around their bedroom. It was like a dream come true. He turned back to his bride-to-be and smiled. He threw on his pants and headed down to the kitchen to grab himself a drink. He hoped there was a beer or two left over. Nothing was as good as a cold beer after sex, he thought. He let out a wahoo when he opened the fridge and saw there was plenty left. He grabbed a bottle and twisted the top off. He took a long pull off the bottle before leaning against the counter, looking over the boxes he had yet to unpack. A chore that he really didn't mind having to do. Being out on their own was worth it, even if they didn't have much. He didn't mind Christy's parents. Well, her foster parents. Even though they'd split up, both of them continued to be a part of her life. She had lived with her foster mother since they divorced 2 years ago. Sometimes Christy would tell him that she wanted to know her real parents, but she had no way of knowing. Her foster parents refused to help her. Brandon heard a thump from upstairs. "Babe?" he called out, but only silence followed. He put his beer down on the counter and moved towards the stairs. He heard no movement upstairs. "Maybe it's just the house settling," he said, and went back to his bottle. A loud thump came from upstairs, this time with a scream. It was not the house settling. He ran to the stairs, but a half-dozen steps up he froze. Standing at the top of the stairs was a black form. Its eyes glowed red with hatred.
Intrusus,
It said, in a guttural voice. Brandon felt his knees give out, and he fell back onto the hard kitchen floor. He slid into the corner of the cabinets. Brandon was paralyzed with fear, but he heard something coming down the stairs, and Christy was screaming. He couldn't turn his head to look. He listened as the noise went through the kitchen to the hall, and then he heard a door open and slam shut. Then there was only silence. It took him another minute before he could move. He got to his feet and called out to Christy, but he heard no reply. He ran into the hall and looked for her. He saw a small blood trail leading to the basement door. He grabbed a flashlight in the living room and headed towards the basement. He placed his hand on the knob and yanked it open, not sure what to expect, but only darkness greeted him. He shone the light on the wooden basement steps. He saw the same blood trail leading down into the abyss. "Christy?" he called out. There was no reply. He took a test step down and waited. For what, he wasn't sure. He continued down into the darkness. He'd never been in the basement before. When he came to look over the house, he had Sam look over the furnace and other things in the basement. His boss knew more about those kinds of things. Now he wished he'd gone down those stairs before, to know what he was walking into. He reached the bottom of the stairs and shone the light around the basement. He followed the trail of blood that led off to the right from the stairs. A moment later he came to a wooden wall, with a door built in with odd symbols, marked in black paint on it. Brandon paused and took a deep breath. The hairs on the back of his neck rose, and he felt rooted in place. What if the thing he saw at the top of the stairs was in here? What if it had Christy? He looked around the old wooden shelves for some kind of weapon, although he didn't know what good it would do. Brandon found a crowbar and picked it up with his left hand. He shined the light on the door that led deeper into the basement. The symbols written in black paint there looked foreboding to him. He couldn't place why, but something primordial told him to run. Leave Christy and run. He couldn't leave her, though. She was the only thing that made existence worth it for him. He took a deep breath, trying to gather his resolve and grab the handle of the wooden door. It was hot to the touch, and he yanked his hand back. He used a rag he found to grab it a second time, and yanked it open. Dancing flames met him. the heat off which assaulted him immediately. He saw Christy, surrounded by a ring of fire, her legs bound at her slender ankles and her hands tied behind her back with some kind of leather strap. She was still naked from their foray earlier, her short cropped blonde hair sticking to her face with sweat generated by the heat. "Christy!" he called out and took a step closer. Christy's head snapped towards him. "No, Brandon, stay back," she called out with panic in her voice. A shadow moved off to the left. Brandon barely caught the movement out of the corner of his eye.
Intrusus.
The thing said toward him. "Christy, are you okay?" Brandon said, facing the shadow and sidestepping toward the circle of flame. I'm okay," she said. "Brandon, run! Just run!" she said. "I can't leave you," he said back and watched the shadow move closer. Somehow it was darker than the blackness behind it.
Lex debe incephare.
It said in a hateful voice. "What does it want?" Brandon asked his fiancée. He could feel the heat on his bare back. He was only a few feet from the flames. "I don't know. I don't understand it," she said. "Can you move? If you were free?" Brandon asked.
In regenerans et non cesserant.
The creature said and moved closer to Brandon, taking a swipe at him with a shadowy claw. "Fuck off," he said as he ducked back, the flames nearly licking his flesh. He shone the light from the flashlight on the creature, and it wailed and recoiled back into the recesses of the chamber. Brandon put the flashlight in his mouth, keeping it trained on the last place he saw the creature. He dug into his jeans front pocket. He fumbled for a few seconds. "Where did it go?" Christy called out. Brandon pulled his hand out of his pocket and smiled, with success. He held his pocket knife up in the light from the flames. He looked down at his bare feet inside. This was gonna hurt. He gave one more quick glance around for the creature before leaping over the flames. They burned his feet and the bottom of his jeans, and he bit his tongue to keep the scream inside. He cut the leather holding her hands. Suddenly, the flames died out. The room sank into darkness. "Here," Brandon said, placing the knife in Christy's hands. "Cut yourself loose." He shone the flashlight around the room, the light slowly dying as the battery drained of life. As it dimmed, he saw the red, hateful eyes from the creature in the corner of the room. It was moving side to side, as if brimming with energy, but no way to expel it.
Mortis es pro vobis.
It said, and started to move closer. Brandon dropped the dying light and gripped the crowbar in both hands. "Come on, you son of a bitch," he called out to the darkness. "Brandon, no matter what, I love you," Christy said. The creature screamed in the darkness. And the attack didn't come. "I love you too, Christy," he replied. Once again, the creature screamed. Brandon could just barely make out its shape on the floor, curled up in a fetal position. It took him a minute to understand. He swung the crowbar down across the monster, who was now not much more than just a shadow. The physical form of the creature cried out as Brandon rained down blows with the crowbar, Christy cheering him on. She grabbed the flashlight and tapped it against her arm. The beam lit up the small chamber, and she aimed it at the creature. It screamed and began to smoke from the light. Brandon didn't stop swinging until the muscles in his arms gave out. He collapsed on the floor, exhausted. Christy rushed to his side, tears streaming from her face. She wrapped her arms around him, dropping the flashlight. The light died, and they sat there in the darkness. "What the fuck was that thing?" Brandon asked. "I don't know," Christy replied. Just then, a white light lit up the room from behind them. They both turned towards the light. A ghostly woman stood there in a white dress that flowed around her, as if by a gentle breeze. But there wasn't one. They could see through her form. Her face looked so much like Christy's it was uncanny. It smiled down at them, then floated closer. That's when they noticed she had no feet. The transparent body was just dissipated at the ankles. Neither of them felt scared. In fact, the incorporeal woman gave off a feeling of peace. It reached out with a ghostly hand. "My Kate," it said in a voice that sounded far away, "you have broken the demon's hold on our family." "Mom?" Kate asked, standing up in front of the ghostly image. "Is it really you?" "Yes, Kate. This was my house. I was raped and I died there on that altar, murdered by the same demon you have just defeated. I didn't have the love in my life that you do." With that, the ghost turned towards Brandon. "Thank you. It was your love for my daughter that saved her, and her family." "No problem," Brandon said, getting to his feet and kicking the demon's body one more time for good measure. "My mother was into the occult in the 60s. She accidentally summoned that demon from the abyss. It haunted her throughout her entire life. She died when I was only 6 years old in a bedroom upstairs, the beast trying to impregnate her to give birth to a child born of both demon and human. A creature of evil that would be born from this world, therefore couldn't be banished from it. A loophole to allow evil in. The demon was too rough on her. It haunted me as well. I fell victim to it. I am so glad you are safe, Christy. Now we can rest in peace, no longer plagued by the demon." Check this out," Brandon said, drawing attention to the corpse on the ground. It began to smolder and turn to ash. "It cannot remain on the physical plane, living or dead," the ghost said. "You have cleansed your world from this evil. I must go. I have been waiting a long time for this," the image of Christy's mom said, and began to rise toward the ceiling. "I love you, daughter. Thank you," it said, and disappeared up through the house. Christy was crying in the now darkness left in the basement. Brandon took her hand, and together they made their way to the stairs and up to the kitchen. He fawned over the wound on her head that was bleeding. He patched her up the best he could and tried to convince her to go to the hospital, but she wasn't interested. "Thank you, Brandon. You mean the world to me," Christy said, and wrapped her arms around him. He smiled and tried to hide the tear in his eyes from her. He was too macho to show that he was crying. "My hero," she said in a sing-song voice, and gave him a peck on the cheek. They both cracked up laughing, not just from her corny joke, but from all the tension of their first night in their new home.
The Blind Date by Joe Solo.
Cassandra wasn't like most teen girls. She didn't enjoy the same things that the other girls in school did. She didn't chase after boys or dress in the latest fashions. It was a rare sight to see Cassandra wearing makeup on a day other than Halloween. That was the only holiday that Cassandra cared about. She felt that was the only night she could actually be herself. She loved reading gothic horror, curled up in her bed. Her bookshelf was lined with the classics, Dracula, Frankenstein, and Dr. Jekyll, to name a few. The newer romantic takes on the classics made her feel sick and angry. They were taking her beloved stories and twisting them to attract the same people she loathed and escaped into the books to get away from. Cassandra had one person she really would call a friend. A girl 2 years older than her started talking to her in lunch one day. Betty was her name. She dressed in all black clothes and dyed her hair as black as she could. Cassandra adopted her look almost instantly. They shared a lot of the same interests. The only difference between the two was that Betty was interested in the opposite sex. She occasionally had a boyfriend, and the time the two friends shared sometimes was strained. But Cassandra really didn't worry. She would just dive into a book until Betty and her boyfriend were broken up a week later. Betty had a volatile temperament, especially with her boyfriends. None of her relationships lasted a month. One time she came over to Cassandra's house with a black eye. Her boyfriend at the time, Randy, punched her in the face. Betty said she cut Randy with a switchblade she carried at all times. Randy lived a few towns over, so Cassandra never met him or saw him to verify the story. "Come on, Cassandra, a boyfriend might do you some good," Betty chided one time. She laughed it off at the time, but truthfully, sometimes she did think about it. Having someone to share her dreams with, other than Betty, wouldn't be so bad, she told herself. After almost a year of joking around, Betty started to get insistent, especially after meeting her newest boyfriend, Brandon. She had met Brandon on a new goth dating site. Cassandra warned her against it, but Betty argued that the site screens all the people on there. On their first date, Cassandra followed them, just in case, but everything went well. "Cassandra, come on, just make a profile, then you can see who's on there. You never know, maybe your future husband is on there," Betty said, applying her black lipstick in Cassandra's vanity mirror. She had a date with Brandon later that evening and was getting ready at Cassandra's house because she could borrow her clothes. "Maybe it's not a husband you're after. They have women, too," Betty said with a laugh and playfully tossed the lipstick at her friend. "Oh, stop," Cassandra said back. "Well, what are you? Asexual?" Betty asked. "I just think getting a boyfriend is more trouble than it's worth. I don't need some asshole calling me when I have 50 pages left of my favorite book," Cassandra said as she pulled a black lacy dress from her closet. "Here, wear this one. It'll make you look slutty. Brandon will love it." "I wouldn't want to lead him on," Betty said. They both looked at each other and smiles crept onto their faces. They both burst out with laughter. It wasn't like Betty slept around, but if the mood struck her, then she wouldn't be shy with her boyfriend. It was cool for the guys to sleep with any girl they could, but if the kids at school saw Betty doing it, they would call her a slut. That was probably why Betty dated boys from out of town, Cassandra thought. Betty's phone dinged with a text message, and Cassandra used that interruption to check her hair in the mirror. It was time to dye her roots again. She would have to run out to the drugstore. She heard Betty laugh and looked at her friend. "What's so funny?" Cassandra asked. "Brandon, he's so funny. He asked me if he should bring condoms," Betty replied. "You guys have only been dating for like 2 weeks. Jesus," Cassandra said. "Yeah, but he's been real good to me so far. He deserves a treat," Betty said in a playful voice and slapped her own ass. "You're too much," Cassandra said with a smile and a roll of her eyes. A short time later after Betty left, Cassandra sat in her room with a copy of In a Glass Darkly. It was the 7th time she'd read the collection of short stories by Sheridan Le Fanu. Her eyes kept drifting from the written word to her laptop Betty had left open on the end of her bed. After the 3rd time she sighed and put her book down. She typed in the web address for the gothic single site Betty had used to find Brandon. "I'll only look for fun and to shut Betty up," she thought as she began to make a profile. She took a selfie with her cell phone and uploaded it. Once that was done, she browsed through a few men's profiles, looking superficially at them. She grew bored a few minutes later and put her phone down. She looked back towards her book, but she wasn't in the mood, so she popped in the DVD of Ginger Snaps, her favorite werewolf movie. After a few minutes, a ding came from her phone. Betty?" she said, picking up her phone, but saw it wasn't a text message at all. It was a notification from the goth dating website. Someone had viewed her profile and wanted to chat. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't actually talk to a guy, could she? Even over the internet, she wasn't sure she would have the confidence enough to talk to someone in that manner. She tapped her finger on the thumbnail image to open his profile, but it instead opened the chat window. "Fuck," she said as she saw the mystery guy was typing. She looked at the enlarged photo of him. He had shoulder-length black hair. He wore a black leather jacket in his picture. She looked at the name attached to the profile. Jeremy, 19. He was cute, she had to admit, as she scrolled through his information. But ding! A new message from Jeremy. She tapped on the notification. "Hi there, I'm Jeremy. I love reading horror. I listen to goth music and just graduated. You look real pretty in your profile picture." Even though he wasn't there in person, she blushed anyway. No one had ever called her pretty before. Well, except for Betty, but that didn't count. Even her own parents that mostly left her alone never complimented her on anything. "What should I say?" she whispered out loud as she looked at her phone. She began to type a message, then deleted it. After a few tries, she finally got out what she wanted to say. Sort of. "Thanks, you're pretty too. I love horror." She looked back at her message after hitting send. "Oh, God damn it," she exclaimed. "You're pretty too? What the fuck is wrong with me?" She saw that he was typing back to her and she cringed, imagining his response to her. She knew that she wasn't ready to chat with a guy. She wasn't cool like Betty. She wished her friend was there now to tell her what to say. She would probably tell her to send a pic of her boobs. Thanks. What kind of music do you listen to?" Well, that wasn't as bad as she thought. He just thanked her. She thought about what to say back. "Mostly local music. Have you ever been to the Freezer?" she asked. It was a local club that she'd been to. One of Betty's old boyfriends had a band, and they went there a few times. Some of the bands she actually enjoyed, except for Betty's boyfriends. They were terrible. "The club over on 34th? I'm there right now. Chum Trail is playing tonight. They start in a half an hour. You should come out." She hadn't heard of a band called Chum Trail. She thought about it, but she'd never been there without Betty. She wasn't sure she could do it. She quickly texted her friend to get some advice. "Are you coming?" Jeremy messaged her. She waited a few more seconds. "Come on, Betty, you twat, message me back," she said to her phone. A minute passed and still nothing. "Hello?" She felt bad for not messaging Jeremy back, but she was indecisive. She wasn't the outgoing person Betty was, and sometimes she was content just to follow in the wake of her friend. She sighed as she looked at her phone laying on the black comforter on her bed. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore and picked up her phone. She opened the messaging app and started to type to Jeremy that she couldn't make it tonight. But some other time. But she only got 2 letters typed before she received a text message from Betty. "WTF, go!" "I knew she would say that," Cassandra said and let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "Okay." She typed it to Jeremy and flinched when she hit send. She could always not go and say something came up anyway. "Sweet, I'll be outside waiting for you." Ah, shit. Now she had to go. She jumped off the bed and looked into the closet her and Betty had destroyed earlier to dress Betty up. Now it was her turn. Although she was very apprehensive about going, she had to admit she was excited as well. She fixed her hair in the mirror quick and then put on the black lipstick that Betty had borrowed earlier. 10 minutes later found Cassandra jumping into her beat-up 1990 Dodge Omni. Her mom passed her in the doorway and didn't even ask where she was going. It was for the best anyway. She didn't want to have to explain. Ba-ding! She looked down at her phone and saw she had a text message from Betty. She looked at it as she buckled her seatbelt. "Are you going, bitch?" She smiled and texted back. "Yes, what the hell?" She put her car into reverse and backed out into the road. She headed down the street, towards the club. Ba-ding! She waited until she reached a red light before checking her phone. It was another text from Betty. "You go, slut!" Cassandra rolled her eyes and smiled. She tucked her phone away before continuing down the street. A few minutes later, she pulled up alongside the curb on 34th Street. She had to park 3 blocks from the club. It must be crowded tonight, she thought. She exited her car and straightened the black camisole she was wearing. She made sure her skirt was in order before heading down the street, towards the Freezer. When she got closer, she noticed a line of people waiting to get into the club. Any one of those could be Jeremy. She wondered if she could recognize him from his picture. It was probably some middle-aged pedophile, she joked to herself as she crossed the last street to reach the club. There was no doubt which one was Jeremy. She could pick him out easily enough. He looked just like his picture. Exactly. In fact, he was wearing the same outfit. I wonder if he only has 1 pair of clothes, she thought jokingly. He recognized her just as fast. He left his place in line to approach her with a smile on his face. "Cassandra, you made it," he said. "Yeah, at least for a little while. My friend said she might need me later." She lied, so she would have an out later if she needed it. "Cool," he said. "Hopefully you can stay for Chum Trail." "Sorry you had to lose your place in line," she said, pointing to the people lined up around the corner. "It's okay. I'd rather wait longer hanging around with you than go in there alone. Honestly, I didn't think I'd meet anyone on that app. I just made my profile tonight, actually, just before leaving the house. I was bored standing in line here, so I started looking at profiles and I saw yours," he said. "So, do you own more than 1 set of clothes?" she asked with a smile. "Sure do. I have at least 3 shirts," Jeremy said as they turned the corner. There wasn't that many more people around the corner. It wouldn't be that long of a wait anyway. They chatted as they waited to get in. The line moved slowly but steadily until they were at the door. The doorman didn't check their ID, just asked for the $5 cover charge for entry. The place was a dump. The walls were all spray-painted black, and there were holes in the floor that had plywood nailed down over them, making a tripping hazard just as bad as the hole originally was. Death metal music blared from the PA as opening bands started to set up their gear on the small raised stage. They made their way over to the bar and got some cheap draft beer, then found a spot to talk while they waited for the music to start. A blonde-haired guy pushed past them with a guitar case, then turned towards Jeremy with recognition. "Jeremy! Glad you could make it, man. We go on second," he said. Jeremy shook the guy's hand and patted him on the back before turning back towards Cassandra. "My friend's band is playing," he said. "So, tell me something. Why is a pretty girl like you looking on the internet for dates?" he asked. Cassandra put her head down, covering her face with her hair to hide the blushing. She didn't even know how to respond to the compliment. Her mind was momentarily blank, so she hid the fact by taking a drink from her beer. It gave her the extra time she needed to formulate a response. "I got on there because of my friend Betty. She kind of bullied me into it. She said I needed to find myself a boyfriend," she said. "Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves," he said, smiling. "One day at a time," she said, holding up her drink. They both laughed at her corny Alcoholics Anonymous joke. She had left her phone on vibrate in her pocket, so she pulled it out and saw she had a few messages from Betty. Jeremy looked at her as she looked at her phone. "Betty, she's on a date tonight, but is asking me how mine is going," she explained. "So this is a date?" Jeremy asked. "Oh my God, I didn't mean to presume," she started to say, but he interrupted her. "Relax, I'm just messing with you," he said. She let out a sigh and visibly relaxed. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yeah, I'm fine." She turned towards the stage. "What do you know about the first band?" she asked. They spent the rest of the evening making idle chit-chat between bands and enjoying the music. She had to admit she was having a good time. Betty texted her regularly asking how the date was going throughout the evening. When Chum Trail hit the stage, they moved up as close as they could. Jeremy knew the words to all the songs. By the end of the night, Cassandra was pretty exhausted, but every time Jeremy spoke, it re-energized her for just a little longer. They walked down the street in the cool night air towards her car. Her ears rang from the loud music. "Well, here we are," she said, pointing to her car. "That thing still runs?" he asked. "Hey, don't knock Roger," she said. "Roger?" "Don't ask," she said, smiling. "Are you really gonna leave?" he asked. "Well, the concert's over," she said. "What else is there to do?" "Well, we could ride over to Johnson Field and walk amongst the trees," Jeremy said. "Just walk?" she asked. "Yeah, just a nice midnight stroll through the park. Unless you want to walk through the cemetery across the street from there," he asked. "Let's start with the park. Meet you there?" she said, digging her keys out of her purse. "You can drive, I trust you. You only had one beer," he said, opening the passenger door of her Dodge. "That's because I'm only 17, she exclaimed. Jeremy laughed as he climbed inside. "Come on, let's go," he said, closing the door. Cassandra ran to the front of the car and jumped inside. The old engine fired right up and they headed towards Johnson's Field. When they arrived, there were several other cars there. Other couples came out to the park for a private moment or two. "I wouldn't be surprised if Betty was there," she thought. "It looks crowded in there," she said. "Let's go over to the graveyard then. I'm sure it's much more romantic," Jeremy said. Cassandra shivered in the cold night air. "Are you cold?" "Here," he said, pulling off his jacket and handing it to her. "Won't you be cold?" she asked. He shook his head no and took her hand in his. It was the first time he touched her all night. She was so startled she almost pulled away, but after a few seconds she relaxed and realized she enjoyed his touch. His hand was warm and rough, like a carpenter's hand. They crossed the street and hopped the fence into the graveyard, landing in the cool dew that layered the grass. The light from the streetlights didn't penetrate very far into the graveyard. They clambered their way to a path and followed it in deeper. Near the middle of the cemetery was a big circle of grass with a memorial statue to the town's founder. 3 discolored stone benches surrounded the statue. They sat down on a cold stone in silence for a few moments before Jeremy spoke. "From here you can see the stars," he said, looking up into the night sky. "You can almost forget you're in a city. It's nice, Well, other than all the dead people, she said with a sly smile. Oh, they won't bother you, mostly, he said and laughed. Cassandra laughed too and pulled her phone out of her purse. She looked at the time. 12:18. You don't need your phone out here. Here we can get away from the technology. Just for a little while. We can have a person-to-person conversation, he said, facing her. I just wanted to see what time it is, she said, putting it back into her purse. He smiled at her. I didn't mean to sound abrasive. I apologize, he said and put out his hand to shake. She took it, and they shook. How weird, she said. That's me, he replied and stood up. Gotta take a whiz, he said and walked a little way into the darkness around the back of the statue. She stood up from the bench and wrapped her arms around herself and shivered. The jacket helped her upper arms, but her bare legs had goosebumps. She questioned why she was out in the middle of the night with a strange boy she met online sitting in a cemetery. She looked towards the statue towering over her in the faint light from the street. There were words carved into the stone plaque just below the man's feet. She traced her fingers over the letters before stepping back to read them. Abraham Buchanan, founding member, shot 7 times, and still fought for his country. 1735 to 1794, died peacefully in his sleep. Cassandra vaguely remembered the story of their town's founding. They drilled it into your head in elementary school, but she hadn't thought of the guy in years. She remembered he survived being shot 7 times in a battle, but persevered. That was part of the town's motto, persevere through strife. Jeremy? She called out into the darkness. Are you still there? Yes, I'm here, he said as he emerged from the darkness. He had his thumbs hooked into the belt loops of his jeans. Oh, I wasn't pissing, he said, stepping closer to her. The hair on the back of her neck began to stand up. She didn't know why, but she was getting a sinking feeling in her stomach. What the hell were you doing then? She asked. I had to make arrangements, he said, reaching behind his back. Arrangements? Listen, Jeremy, it was real nice meeting you, but I think it's time I went home, she said, taking a step back from him. He paced her, taking another step forward. She took off his jacket and held it out at arm's length. Here's your jacket. Jeremy just stood there with his hand behind his back, making no move to take his jacket. Don't leave now, Cassandra. It's almost time, he said. No, I have to go, she said and dropped the jacket onto the worn cemetery path. I have to go home, she said and stepped back another step. You are home, Cassandra, he said and pulled a knife from behind his back. The blade was curved about 15 inches long. Cassandra turned to run away, but Jeremy was quicker. He wrapped his arm around her neck and pulled her close to him. Why would you want to leave? It's so peaceful here. Come on and meet the family, he said, dragging her back to the statue. He dropped her on the ground in front of the plaque. Look on that phone of yours and tell me what time it is. It has to be close, he said. Close to what? She asked, her eyes widening in horror. The time I died, of course, Jeremy explained and stepped closer to her. What? She asked. I only took 3 bullets, not 7 like old Abe here. Do you know the story of Abe? Let me tell you what the school didn't. Abe was shot 7 times by British soldiers in the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. They dragged him back behind the front lines and left him to die. Which he should have, and would have, if something didn't intervene. Old Abe prayed to God to save him. He wanted to see his children grow up. He wanted to see his grandchildren. He had a wife and a mistress back home. He wasn't ready to leave this world. It wasn't God who answered him, though, Jeremy said, sitting on the bench within reach of Cassandra. A being came to Abe and told him they could save him. He wanted to live for selfish reasons, so God didn't answer, but a demon did. It promised him a freebie, a full recovery if it brought the demon 3 souls every 7 years. Abe quickly agreed, he explained, and pulled Cassandra's face up to look into her eyes. Are you getting all this? There will be a quiz, he said and let go. Please, I don't know what you're talking about. Just let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear, she said as a tear dripped down her cheek. He wiped it away with his finger, which was warm to the touch. Don't cry, sweetheart. There's no reason to. Crying is useless. Now back to the story. Abe lived till 1794 as far as anyone knows. That's when his actual life ended. But his deal went on. After his body died, he was allowed to continue to bring souls to the demon, and in return, he could wander the land of the living a little longer. Well, one night in 1988, I just happened to be sitting on this bench here with some friends drinking. A man stepped out of the darkness and asked us for our wallets, he said with a smile. He stood and turned around in a circle, taking in the night. It was right here, at 12:48, that I was shot for not giving him my wallet. My friends all ran and got away, but I laid here, in a pool of my own blood, with 3 bullets in me. I looked up at that statue of Abe there and wondered how he could live through 7 bullets when I was going to die from only 3, he scoffed. Kinda silly, I know. Cassandra looked at her phone. It said 12:43. She started to text Betty. Oh no, we wouldn't want your friend to ruin the party. You see, Abe came to me that night and offered me the same deal he had. And you're my 3rd date this week, he said, swiping the phone from her hands. I can't believe how small these things have gotten over the years. Please, she begged. I won't tell anyone. I'll just go home. I'm sorry. That isn't going to work. I need you, Cassandra. And isn't it romantic? A great night spent together. That's the best part of this job. I get to meet lots of chicks, he said. Just then, there was a small rumble in the ground, and a faint red light started to illuminate the statue. Fissures of smoke rose from the cracks in the ground. He's almost here to take his 3rd soul. I'm going to need you to lay down on this bench, Jeremy said. Fuck you, she said in defiance. He struck her with the pommel of the knife he'd held in his hand. What a mouth on you. I like your spunk, he said and pulled her onto the bench. He sat on her chest and undid the laces on her knee-high boots. He tied her legs to the stone bench. This is ridiculous, she said, trying to struggle as he tied her hands under the bench behind her back. The rumbling grew louder, and she felt the bench shaking just a bit. Let me go right the fuck now, she called out. Or what? Are you going to untie yourself and escape? It's never happened. Oh, I know. You could try screaming. They usually try that, but it's not going to work, he said, standing back and looking at his handiwork. Cassandra kicked, trying to loosen her restraints, but they were too tight. She called out into the night, Help! Help! Jeremy smacked her again. I really like it when they struggle, but the voices are pretty annoying, he said, and giggled. The rumbling climaxed as a ghostly figure floated out front of the statue. Oh, Abe, look at this one. 100% virgin. Really, it should count as 2, Jeremy said to the ghost. Please, God, don't let me die, she begged.
God doesn't listen, child,
Abraham said in a gravely spectral voice. He floated over to her and bent down near her face. Cassandra could see through Abraham. His transparent body had a reddish hue, but was definitely not solid. Please, she said.
There's no escape for you, I'm afraid. I am a selfish man, and I need you.
The specter said. And I need you too, Jeremy said to her. Is it time? He asked the specter.
It is time,
The ghost of Abraham said, and backed away a few feet from Cassandra. Okay, baby, your time is up, Jeremy said and approached her, putting the knife just above her heart. She struggled harder, but she couldn't get any momentum going. The shoelaces were just too tight. She screamed out. He raised the knife above his head and looked down at Cassandra. Here's to 7 more years, he said, and plunged the knife into her chest. The last thing she saw as the world turned black was the fury on Jeremy's face. But the betrayal from the first guy she ever dated hurt more than that wound in her chest.